I'm now going to introduce Sarah Gatoski. And I know Sarah because I attended the Birding by Ear workshop, and I would highly recommend it for anybody who's interested at all in just learning to identify birds by ear or by sight. It really doesn't matter. It was a really fun weekend. And Sarah has an excellent way of teaching people and a really enthusiastic approach to birding. So it was a great fun. Actually, my daughter had bought it for me for a birthday present. So you might want to spread the words to your children to ask for a birthday present. So I guess that's going to happen at the end of June this year at the Harrison Lewis Center near Port Joli. So Sarah is an adventure specialist. She's been guiding expeditions in the Arctic and Antarctic and many other remote areas around the globe for more than a decade. In 2016, Sarah completed her PhD in biology at Dal, and she currently teaches ornithology and conducts research on birds in Nova Scotia and beyond. She's going to discuss her work with herring gulls. Sarah conducts GPS tracking of herring gulls in Southwest Nova Scotia and Grand Manan Islands to quantify the use of anthropogenic food sources. So the use of how much herring gulls use food or are dependent on food from human sources, such as fish plants, aquaculture sites, and mink farms, etc. This work will hopefully guide industry best practice for reducing gull reliance on human food and the subsequent boost to gull populations. So because they're so capable of finding food from these human-based sources, their populations have increased, and that is a balance problem in our environment. So without further ado, Sarah, you can share your screen and begin your presentation.
Thanks, Diane. Let's see if this is going to work for us. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, and you can see the presentation there?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. Let me just see if I can, there we go. Okay, well, thanks for the invitation to talk to you guys. It's been a long time since I've given a presentation for the Bird Society, actually, since my PhD work at Dal. So I've been up to a lot since then, lots of different projects. And this one in particular, I'm really excited about because we just wrapped it up and submitted it for publication, and it's just been accepted and it will be published in about 2 weeks. So hot off the press. If at any point you can't hear me or I cut out, if you just want to maybe unmute yourself and give me a heads up, that would be really helpful. So like Diane said, this work is trying to get at the question of how much gulls in our local area rely on human-based food. So this is work that I've been carrying out, but as part of a much larger team, I've just been leading the research. So let's see, here we go. So this is the real title of the work that is going to be published in just a few weeks' time, and I'll be happy to share that once it's out. It'll be an open access article anyway. But this work has been a really big collaborative effort. Myself and 8 co-authors, some of whom are attending as well. So we've got Katie Sedholm and Rob Ronconi, Corella Lard, Kate Schlepper, Tony Diamond, Jesse McIntyre, Sean Craig, and Mark Mallory. And you probably recognize some of those names. Some of them are profs at local universities. Some of them are government biologists as well. So this work really was a huge collaboration, not only these co-authors, but of course, countless field assistants and volunteers. We've got many universities, local universities who are involved, and government agencies and NGOs. Lots of funding support from lots of different bodies. And most importantly, I want to acknowledge before we jump in that this work was sort of the motivation behind this work was from some important work done by the Southwest Nova Priority Place Coastal Islands Working Group. And so the Canadian government has a program where they identify priority places within the country, and Southwest Nova Scotia is one of those priority places, and in particular our coastal islands. And so these folks participated through this collaborative planning process where the working group is made up of many different stakeholders and perspectives locally in Southwest Nova. And they identified that the impacts of some problematic native species, such as gulls, are a threat to coastal island biodiversity, and specifically species at risk in Southwest Nova Scotia. So that's part of the motivation for why this work was done in the first place, just to give you a little bit of context. Okay. So let's do a little talk roadmap here and lay out sort of what we're going to cover and where we're going. We'll start with a very quick overview of herring gulls, because I think probably everyone in attendance is familiar with this bird. We'll talk a little bit about gull populations and impacts locally, lay out what the research questions were that we set out to answer with this research. We'll talk about how we did it, what we found, and what the major takeaways are from that. Okay, you can still hear me all right? Are we all good? Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Diane, for the nod. Okay, so the herring gull. Everyone's familiar with herring gulls. They're the most widespread larid in the Northern Hemisphere. These birds are a very common sight on our coasts. No matter where you go in coastal Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, you'll see a scene like this image on the bottom here, where we've got our two big gulls. We've got our great blackback gulls and our herring gulls. And herring gulls are huge, actually. They have a wingspan of 1.5 meters. They have those bright, stark white bodies. They're actually beautiful birds, and they're hard to miss because they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They are on our beaches, waterfronts, wharfs, airports, dumps, parking lots, you name it, they're usually around. So we've just got a lot of really great habitat for them in our region. And we've got lots of great nesting areas for them as well. So you know that herring gulls usually nest in colonies on isolated islands where they're essentially safe from land-based predators. And rooftops, of course, work great for that too. So essentially a rooftop is an urban island. And so it's not uncommon to see these birds, of course, in urban areas and in big numbers. They're gregarious, they're social. And so when they're not, say, attending their chicks, we know they have nests of 2 to 3 eggs at a time. If they're not at the nest or they're not foraging, they're usually loafing and socializing. When they are foraging, they use this sort of generalist scavenger foraging strategy. We're all familiar with this. I'm sure we've all seen a gull eat something that shocked us. And they also have this inherent, what we call neophilia, which means they're just not afraid of novel and new things, and they're very bold. You know, you've had a bird try to steal your sandwich, I'm sure. So this means that they're really well adapted to discover and access all the diverse resource options. And in our region, that means a smorgasbord of both natural foraging opportunities and human influence foraging opportunities in all sorts of environments, from offshore to the coastline, all the way inland. And so I just want to lay out from the outset here that by no means is the intention of this work to villainize gulls. I think we can all agree that gulls are fascinating. They're remarkable birds. They deserve the same adoration as any other bird. The point is just that we need to recognize how our human behavior is influencing gulls and how that in turn can create challenges for local ecosystems, human communities, and industries. So we've long known that gulls interact with industry in all sorts of different industries throughout their range. Herring gulls have actually been in great fluctuation in terms of their numbers over the last century. First, they increased at the beginning of the last century because of all of the food subsidies provided by fisheries discards, especially at sea, and open landfills. And so gull numbers in general across Atlantic Canada increased, and then we implemented some big changes in our open landfill practices and fisheries discards, and gull populations actually declined. they've shown pretty severe declines actually over the last half of the last century. And so those declines have actually been so great in some places that, like in the UK, for example, they've been added to the red list. So we don't usually think of the herring gull as a species that is threatened, but in fact they are, but they're just also very common. They're also locally very abundant. And so I'm sure we're all familiar with this, where we arrive somewhere on the coast or in a coastal community and it feels like the gull population is quite high. And that's because they're very high in local pockets, and they're high enough to have detrimental impacts on sensitive coastal ecosystems in a number of ways. But one, perhaps you've had the unfortunate experience of seeing a gull predate other birds, for example, and this is quite common. Gulls, it's part of their natural history strategy to not only sort of push out other species, but also to depredate other seabird species or bird species and their chicks. And this has been a big problem for some of our species here in our region, like the common eider, for example. And you can see on the bottom right here, this is an image from Mark Mallory, where we've created nest shelters for eiders to try and improve their nesting success by giving them some protection from gulls. Obviously, these are blackback gulls in this image, but herring gulls also target eiders. There's actually a hen on the nest here within this shelter. This has been really successful, actually, but gulls are having such an impact on eider populations that this is the point that we're at. And the same goes for tern populations on islands, especially in Southwest Nova. The roseate tern population, for example, takes a big hit from gull predation, especially in the pockets where the gull populations seem to be really high. So it's a really sticky subject and a challenge for wildlife managers, because it's hard to disentangle how high gull populations would be naturally. And it certainly isn't the fault of the gulls, but it's a human management issue. So managing ourselves and our influence on the ecosystems that we have an impact on. And so we know that there's a number of industries in our region that gulls interact with a lot. So despite the fact that we've decreased our or improved our open landfill practices and our fisheries discard policies, there's still quite a few industries that do impact gulls. And three in particular that this study was really interested in. The first is fish processing plants. So we know that we're providing food subsidies through these local industries. Land-based fish processing is a common sight in any coastal fishing community here. And of course, birds are attracted by the potential for discards at plants and offal from nearby effluent pipes. So it's quite common for these plants to have effluent pipes that discharge into the shallow nearshore waters. And so this image here on the bottom right shows an effluent pipe down in the Yarmouth area, where there are, chunks of fish and food that the gulls expect and learn to go to these sites and wait for the food, the free food that's just handed to them on a platter. And so, of course, this is influencing the gulls' behavior. The other fisheries-based industry in our region has certainly gulls are interacting with is open pen finfish aquaculture. So this is really prevalent in New Brunswick, and it's growing in Nova Scotia. There's been quite a bit of news around this lately, since there was a new land-based salmon hatchery has been approved for on Digby Neck in Centerville. It's a huge operation. So fish are grown from egg to smolt on land before they're released into these for rearing into these large open circular pens that are close to shore. And gulls are attracted to these, of course, probably most by the fish feed. And these fish are fed very frequently, and also pen cleaning. So whenever the pens are clean, there's a lot of gunk that is stirred up in the water and on the seabed. So in Nova Scotia, there are currently about 35 open pen finfish sites for Atlantic salmon and rainbow trout. And lots of people, over 500 people in rural parts of the province that are employed working in this industry. It's another really important industry for us here. You know, the new hatchery facility on Digby Neck is going to produce 3 million fish per year. And that's just for supplying that company's 13 pen sites in Nova Scotia. And in the Bay of Fundy, there are hundreds of aquaculture sites. So it's an industry that's hotly debated no matter where it is. Everywhere this industry has been developed, Europe, North America, South America, and most recently here. You know, you can readily understand how disease and parasites might spread where fish are caged in high densities. There's lots of concerns about this type of the industry. But again, it's an important economic driver for our region, and it's a reality that this is along our coastlines, and that our local species like gulls interact with these industries and sites. So the third local industry that is, that's pretty important is the fur farming industry with our mink farming here locally. Mink farms, this is what a mink farm looks like from above. And so there are these long, narrow barns where mink cages are on either side with a central walkway. And you know, thousands of mink are farmed on any one site. And gulls are attracted to these sites because there's a substantial volume of waste that's produced in this process. There's manure, there's waste food, there's carcasses and animal fat, and all of these can be available to birds like gulls, scavengers. And so right now there's between 20 and 30 operating mink farms in the province. We've got about over 100,000 domestic mink. And mink farms have been, again, in the news lately because of COVID, because COVID can actually be transmitted between mink and between humans and mink. And there's been big outbreaks on farms all over the world and huge culls to try and get ahead of it. No outbreaks in Nova Scotia's facilities, and very few in Canada in general. But in Germany alone, they culled over 17 million mink last year. So it's big business in a lot of places, and it's been in decline here in Nova Scotia, but we do still have quite an active industry. So those are the big potentially influential industries for gull behavior in our area. And so our big research questions here, what we were trying to get at with doing this study, we sort of had three big research questions trying to address the fact that, you know, wildlife managers are concerned about gulls because of the potential impact that they can have on local ecosystems, as well as, you know, the public, in terms of damaging property and agricultural crops and posing hazards at airports and spreading contaminants across water reservoirs. You know, they can be a vector for disease, et cetera. And so in order to mitigate those impacts, we need to ask some sort of big questions to even start out. The first one is, you know, how much do gulls in our area actually use natural food sources and habitats versus that anthropogenically influenced or human provided resources or human influenced habitats? So that's the first big question. The second is, do gulls from different colonies use distinct resource types, human versus natural, from these different habitats? Do they use it differently? Do we see differences between colonies, essentially? Or can we generalize to gulls across our whole region or within certain subregions or areas? And then the third big question is, you know, are there localized areas of really intense interaction between gulls and specific industries? So those are sort of the three big questions that we set out to answer. So how do we do it? Well, we had 4 study sites or island colonies that we worked at since 2014, shown here on the map. We had 2 colonies down here in Southwest Nova in sort of the Lobster Bay area, probably familiar with Bon Portage Island and Whitehead Island. So these are pretty small gull colonies in comparison to some others. And these 2, they're only 22 kilometers apart, so they're pretty close together. And the other two colonies that we had were Briar Island, as I'm sure everybody is very familiar with. If you haven't gone on a pilgrimage to go birding there in the spring, it's about time you do. And so Briar Island is a very big colony, but it's kind of a baby colony. It's only about 40 years old. It's grown really rapidly over the last 4 decades because they drained the bog in the middle of the island, and this made perfect herring gull nesting habitat. So if you're on Briar Island and you look to the middle, that's where all the gulls are. And the fourth colony is Kent Island. So this is a pretty far offshore island in the Grand Manan archipelago. And at one point, Kent Island was the largest colony in Atlantic Canada of herring gulls. It was up to about 30,000 nests at one point, even before gulls were abundant elsewhere in the region. But it's a big colony. And so across our study region here, you know, the two most distant study colony islands were 145 kilometers apart. So we've got this sort of nice north-south gradient and some smaller colonies and some larger colonies that we were studying. So at these colonies, we, like Diane mentioned, we were deploying GPS devices, and depending on the colony that you're at, the nesting colony can look a little bit different. So this is the colony at Briar Island versus, say, the colony at Whitehead Island. But we deployed 45 tracking devices over 3 different seasons. And to do that, we had to capture adult gulls on their nests. And so we used this sort of Wile E. Coyote strategy to catch gulls, where we literally put a box trap on a stick attached to a string, and then we pull the string when the bird is under the box and we catch the bird. And so we're very careful about this because we don't want the birds to damage their eggs when, you know, they're trapped and maybe struggling in the trap. And so we remove their eggs and we put them in a safe box, and we put fake eggs inside, and then the bird sort of waddles in through the open space and settles back down on the nest, and then we pull the string and the stick pulls out and the box falls, and then there you have your your bird in a trap. And so then to avoid the bird struggling for too long, we're obviously very vigilant. We go grab the bird quickly. Here's Mark Mallory, happy with his prize of a herring gull. And again, you get a sense for the size of these birds when they're in the hand, I think. So to attach the devices to the birds, we used a leg loop harness with this nice soft Teflon ribbon. And so this is the process of putting a device on a bird. It sort of goes, the device sits nice and snug on their back, and then these loops go and they loop around their legs. And then the device sort of just sits right between the wings on the back. And then we let them go. And they really don't seem to be negatively influenced by these. We kept track of survival of birds as well as their nest success, and overall, it doesn't seem to have a negative impact, and we get a lot of information. So these devices, they're GPS receivers and transmitters. So the receiver part of that is just like in your phone, where your phone GPS can triangulate its own position based on satellites. And so these devices on the birds do just that, and they do it every 15 minutes, and then they record their position onto the onboard storage on the device. And they're satellite powered, so they keep going for as long as they're on the bird, and they're quite waterproof, so the devices can last quite a long time. And to get the data back off of the tags, we actually have this really cool technology where we use receiver ground stations on the colonies. So the devices, the tags on the birds are actually sending out UHF radio waves, and these ground stations pick those up whenever the birds are within 8 kilometers of the station, and they download their data automatically to the base station. And then we go and visit those base stations periodically, and we download the data ourselves off of them. And so it's a pretty slick technology. I think probably every time you guys hear a presentation from someone who's doing tracking work with birds, the technology just keeps advancing and advancing, and it's pretty wild. So this is really neat. This means that these birds could be wearing these tags. We got for some birds, we have data from up to 3 years in a row, because the devices just kept working because of that solar powered and the automatic download. So it's pretty cool. And then eventually they do just fall off. The birds aren't encumbered for life or anything like that. So let's get into some results. This map I'm going to show you is pretty busy, but I'll walk you through it. So each colony here is color coded. So we've got Kent Island up here in blue, Briar in green, Whitehead in orange, and Bon Portage in purple. And all of these spindly lines are the tracks of the birds. And every dot is somewhere that they stopped and spent some time. So like I said, we had positions every 15 minutes. And I only looked at data for the breeding season. So between mid-May to the end of July, because we were only interested in their behavior and their movements during that time. So when they were incubating through to when they fledged their young. And overall, we deployed 45 devices, but not all of them worked perfectly and gave us enough data. So we got what we call 39 bird years of tracking data. And so what that means is, because some birds were tracked in more than 1 year, we consider each year for any bird a sample or part of the sample size. So we have 39 different bird years, and I'll show you a little more about what that means in a bit. So for each bird, for each year, we identified the positions, those 15-minute positions, as being on a foraging trip or at the colony. So that's the first step of looking at the data. And so for all these birds, a foraging trip is when they leave a 1 kilometer buffer around the colony for at least 45 minutes and then return at some point within that. We'd call that one foraging trip. And so with all this data, we ended up with over 4,100 trips from these birds, about 75 per bird. And then on each trip, we identify each position as being a transit position, which means they're on the go, they're moving fast, or a visit position, which is these dots here, where these are series of positions where the birds slowed down their movement. And so it's probably where they're doing something like foraging, loafing, socializing, staying put, and interacting with something. And so with those visits, we identified over 6,000 visits. So then what we want to do is determine the resource type that they were interacting with on each of those visits. So that's the fun part. So I wanted to assign each of those visits to a category. I had 9 potential resource type categories, and they fall into that anthropogenic or human influenced or natural resource types. So for anthropogenic, we had, were they interacting with a mink farm, a fish plant, aquaculture site, or human settlement? And so if they were in an area where there's clearly human influence, but none of these industries, then it would get categorized as human settlement. And then alternatively, were they in a natural environment where they were interacting with freshwater, natural terrestrial? Were they on an uninhabited island without human influence? Were they in the coastal or nearshore environment? So that's 500 meters on either side of the high tide line, either inland or offshore. Or were they properly offshore, so more than 500 meters away from the coast? So to do that, I took the tracks and I took all the positions that were those visits for each bird, and I animated it in Google Earth. And then you can actually look at the positions relative to Google Earth satellite imagery, and you can say with certainty what that bird was interacting with. And so I took a screenshot when I was doing this, and I'm really glad I did, because that means that I can share it with you now how we actually did this. And so what you're seeing here is my computer screen, and I have Google Earth open on the left, and I have an Excel spreadsheet on the right. And you can see that there's this column here called ID. So this bird 6 from Kent Island in 2016, I'm going to categorize its visits, visit 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 75, as being associating with a given habitat type. And so we start by pulling in the Google Earth file, and it loads up in Google Earth. So what this is going to show you is all the positions for visits. And what you can do is you double click on the number of the position and it zooms right in. And so we can see that on visit 1, this bird was very obviously associating with an aquaculture site, no doubt about it. And so we have a little look. I'll make sure that, and then I add it to the spreadsheet, and then I go to the next one. Its next visit, it made to that same aquaculture site. So what that means is it went on some sort of long transit, and then it just came right back to that same aquaculture site. On the next visit, the bird went over to the border of Maine and New Brunswick to this little offshore area. And so we categorize that as near shore. And its next trip, it moved a little bit north. And again, no human influence here, no industry. It's just offshore, but within 500 meters of the shoreline. The next visit, it goes over to another aquaculture site, this time on the New Brunswick side of the border. But you get the idea. And so now this bird is clearly a bit of an aquaculture specialist, at least on this series of trips here. And so we can go through iteratively for all 6,000 visits for these birds. And we can look at this Google Earth imagery and say with pretty good certainty that this bird on its 7th visit here, and if you look, there are, maybe 30 positions in a row that were on this uninhabited island off of the Grand Manan archipelago. So this bird spent, it spent up to 7 hours just here in this one little spot on this island. So clearly we can confidently again say that it was associating just with this uninhabited island on that visit. And so we did this. I'll show you just one more example so that you can see some of the other industries that we can pick out with this Google satellite imagery. So this same bird, again, another visit over here to an aquaculture site. And then its next visit is to this uninhabited island called Goose Island. This was probably one of the most fun desk-based studies I've done. And then it goes over here to what is very clearly a school and a soccer pitch. And it hangs out on the soccer pitch. So this would be a human settlement. So it's an anthropogenic habitat. Actually, there are even gulls that you can see on the roof of the building of the school, which is pretty interesting. And then it goes back over to some aquaculture again. And I'll just show you one more example. So this bird here it's in a human settlement area with piers and a fishing wharf. And then it moves over to this this beach off of Sandy Cove Pond. And then it comes over, I'm gonna back that up a touch. So it was over here in the Grand Manan archipelago of New Brunswick, and it flies across the Bay of Fundy to what is very obviously a mink farm in Nova Scotia. So big movements just to come over for a 45-minute visit to our mink farms in Nova Scotia. So that would get a mink farm designation. Okay, so some results, and I'm sorry that there's graphs here, but I'm going to talk you through it and we'll get through the ugliness of it. So what this is showing you is each pane is for each of the 4 colonies. And what we're looking at is the percentage of time that a bird from each colony spent in a human-related habitats, that's in the yellow, versus natural habitats in the blue. And so if we just look at Kent Island up here, we had 19 birds, and the line in the middle shows you sort of the average for that colony. So Kent Island birds spent about 50-50 time. So about 50% of their time in human-related and 50% of their time in natural. And you can see that there's some differences depending on the colony. So the size of the box sort of tells you the variation among the individuals that we tracked from that colony. So a bit more spread in the birds. So some birds at Briar spent a lot of time in human influenced habitats, whereas other birds spent very little. And birds at Whitehead Island were actually spent significantly more time in human influenced environments than they did in natural. And they were the only colony where there was a significant difference, where they actually overall for all birds, they spent more time in human influenced environments. And they spent more time in human influenced environments than any of the other 3 colonies. So that was sort of the takeaways here. But overall, across all birds at all colonies, about 50-50 spent in each. I don't know if that comes as a surprise to you. I didn't know what to expect when we set out on this. I didn't know if we would see birds essentially ignoring natural habitat or only going into natural habitat. But overall, we saw a little bit more time in anthropogenic habitats than in natural. Okay, the next plot is a bit busy. This one is showing you for each colony, the percentage of time that the birds spent at each of those 9 different habitat types. And so again, if we just look at Kent Island here, the first thing that maybe pops out is that this green box, which is fish plants, is much higher than any of the others, as well as aquaculture. So for Kent Island birds, they spent a very high proportion of their time associating with fish plants and aquaculture, and also a good amount of time with mink farms. And if you look at Briar over here on the right, a lot of time these birds spent around mink farms compared to the other colonies. But overall, across all 4 colonies, every single bird that we tracked visited a fish plant at least once, but most of them spent on average 28% of their time. That's for the whole breeding season, 28% of their time visiting fish plants, spending at least an hour at a time at fish plants. So that tells us that fisheries processing plants are influencing the behavior of gulls pretty clearly. You'd also see that in the gray boxes, this is the time that birds spent on uninhabited islands. So they are spending an absolute ton of time just loafing or foraging on uninhabited islands offshore, to the point where, every colony, except for Bon Portage, has a very high percentage of time spent in that environment. And for the Bon Portage birds, also a lot of time in the coastal and nearshore environment. And just one last busy plot. Okay, that's not true. There's probably another one. This is the mean duration of their visits. So how long did they spend on each individual visit? And the thing that's crazy about this is they made a lot of very long visits to uninhabited islands. So these birds, these gulls, this is not including their own nesting colony. So that's an important differentiation. So they're going to nearby islands and they're spending a lot of time, which you can imagine if there's any breeding birds there, that's going to have an impact on them. And so we're talking visits of, 3 to 8 hours at a time spent on uninhabited islands, very common across all 4 colonies that we tracked. Okay, so I did lie. There's one more really busy plot, but this one's really cool. So this is showing us individual data. So for every single bird that we tracked and how much time that bird spent associating with each of these different resource types. So let's just start down here on the bottom left with whitehead. Look at bird 3. Bird 3 is a fish plant specialist. So green is fish plants. It spent almost 90% of its time at fish plants, which I think is just absolutely incredible. Whereas bird 1 at whitehead spent most of its time around human settlements. So that's not industry influence, but still around, this could be schools, this could be golf courses, this could be anything, agricultural areas as well is lumped in there. For birds from Bon Portage, we've got, birds 2 and 3 spent most of their time in the coastal and nearshore environment, not interacting with industry. Whereas we have some birds from Kent and Briar Island that we tracked in more than 1 year. And the consistency of birds was really incredible for me. So this bird number 2, this is 1 year that we tracked it, and this is the next year we tracked it. And this bird is definitely a fish plant specialist. So it is almost each of those 2 years, it's spending most of its time probably at the same fish plant, whereas bird 9 is spending most of its time in the coastal and nearshore environment. And then the same story over on Briar. We've got birds that are clearly fish plant specialists. And then this bird 11 spending a lot of time at mink farms. And one that just popped out to me now that I think is pretty remarkable is this bird here, number 13, spending, 80% of its time at mink farms. So this is a mink farm specialist. So the takeaway is that there's just tons of individual variation. It's very hard to generalize. We have some general patterns, but it's very hard to generalize because these birds are individuals and they have their own strategies. Okay, so this map is just showing us sort of how all of those different visits were distributed across the landscape for each colony. So in the top left pane here, each dot is a visit and the color of the dot is the resource type that visit was associated with. So this is for Kent Island. So the stars are the locations where birds from that colony spent the most time for that resource type. So mostly around the colony, nice and close to the colony here, we have birds, their favorite aquaculture sites and islands and fish plants were all sort of close to the colony, but they visited all those resource types over in Maine and New Brunswick as well. But then they also flew across the Bay of Fundy. This is 65 kilometers over to this area around Hilltown in Digby County, where there's a high density of mink farms. And this top pane on the right here, this is Briar Island birds and what they got up to. And again, on Peters Island, which has an old lighthouse on it, just off of Briar, it used to be a tern colony and a roseate tern colony, but the terns are gone now. Now it's just gulls. And that was the island where Briar birds spent the most time. And then they were also going all the way over to the Hilltown region mink farm area. Birds from Whitehead down here on the left, they were going all to the north to access those mink farms and then all the other sort of resource types around the colony. Whereas on the bottom right here, Bon Portage birds didn't go to mink farms at all. They stuck around their area and they went offshore to the south and sort of had their favorite spots in East and West Pubnico, which they shared with Whitehead birds close to the colony. So what does all that mean? What are the takeaways relative to the questions that we set out to answer? So what's the relative use of natural versus human influence habitats? About half and half, which we can confidently say that industry is clearly influencing the behavior of these gulls, at least during the breeding season, and that they're traveling really long distances or spending really large proportions of their time interacting with industry in our area. And otherwise, they're paying those really lengthy visits to nearby coastal islands, which was part of the concern that motivated this research, remember. The second question, do gulls from different colonies use these resources differently? Oh yeah, very differently. In some cases, it may be accessibility. So, there are the mink farm region is closer to Briar. There aren't aquaculture sites in high density in Southwest Nova. And so we saw those differences reflected in the birds. But also there's just different attraction clearly because we have birds from Whitehead going north to mink farms and birds from Bon Portage not at all. So maybe we don't know how to explain that, but it definitely means that you can't generalize to the region based on one colony, especially because there's all those huge differences between birds, even from the same colony. And so that last question, where are the localized areas of most intense gull industry interaction? Well, we've already been over this, but yeah, there were very clear areas. This is just an animation of all the tracks. And so we've got, those are the Briar birds, and this is just going by month, and the Kent birds, and then the Bon Portage birds start, and the Whitehead. And you'll see that clearly birds from Kent are coming over to mink farms. Birds from Whitehead and Orange are going north to the mink farms, and Briar as well. But then Bon Portage just doesn't, which I just think is really neat. But there's clearly these distant regions of intense gull industry interaction, regardless of the origins of the birds, but then also near to the colonies, they seem to have their favorite spots, and we can identify those with tracking data like this. And the mink farming question is a really interesting one because over the course of our study, the number of active mink farms in Nova Scotia actually declined. So in 2014, there were 116 active mink farms. And by 2019, there were only 43. So it's a declining industry for sure. but still birds tracked in 2019 went there. So it makes me think that probably the largest mink farming operations are still doing okay, and they're still providing enough resources to make it worthwhile for these birds to make this huge journey to go and access it. And we don't know what the future looks like for mink farming, or how it might continue to impact gull behavior. But given that, bond portage birds don't seem to need to go to mink farms, it's likely that whitehead birds will just adapt and, change which industry they're gonna get their free handouts from. And so overall, the sort of big picture is that even though we've had big practices in some other industries that influence bird behavior, we still have aquaculture and fish processing and fur farming that are definitely providing food subsidies for our local gull populations, but also for distant gull populations. So who would have thought that Nova Scotia mink farms are feeding New Brunswick gulls? But they certainly are. So this has pretty important implications, because if you're trying to mitigate pressures on local ecosystems from local gull colonies, it's very difficult to pinpoint which industries and where you should put your management efforts, because there's just so much variation. And so we didn't necessarily provide an easy blueprint for how to address some of these issues, but we've definitely shone a light on how complicated the problem is, and how extensive it is. So the next big thing that we want to do in our research is study movements of urban nesting gulls and how they may be moving contaminants around in the environment. And so we're on the search for rooftop gull colonies right now, especially in the HRM area. So if you know of any rooftop colonies for herring gulls or ringbill gulls, mostly herring gulls is what we're looking for, please reach out and let me know, because that's what we would like to get going this spring, is doing a similar work in urban areas. And just really quick, some shameless self-promotion, and Diane already did this for me, but yeah, I am going to be offering another Birding by Ear workshop at the end of June at the Harrison Lewis Center. So you can check out their website. They'll have the schedule up in the next few weeks, or you're welcome to get in touch with me at my email. And I'm sure Diane would share that around in her next email blast as well. And if you're interested in this work or any of my other birdie work in Atlantic Canada, you can check out my website, and I have lots of all of the research that I've done is freely available there to have a look at if you're interested. Okay, I think that's all from me.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm sure there's people with questions. People, if you have a question, you can take yourself off mute and ask a question, or type it in to the chat box. I'll try to monitor the chat box, and maybe Sarah, you can too. I did have a question, and it's probably not a good question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Please do.
Have you speculated on why there's these individual differences among birds? Like why some of them seem to be highly specializing or only looking at two sources of food, where others are looking at multiple? They seem to be, more spread out. Is it a socialization? Is it genetic? Do you have any speculation as to why that is?
There's been a lot of research on individual specialization in gulls, especially because they are so adaptable and they can take advantage of different resources. We do see a lot of that individual specialization, and that doesn't necessarily mean that each bird has its thing and it only goes to fish plants, because you saw some birds have a pretty equal access to all the different resource types. And so it's thought that for birds where there's a lot of competition, it pays to specialize, or it can pay to specialize, because you essentially get really good at accessing one resource type, and then you're more competitive in that environment. But it can also pay to be a generalist, because when that resource, say, isn't available for some reason, you can still access food in other ways. And so there's this sort of toss up between what's best, but we tend to see a variety of strategies in species that that forage in highly competitive environments, essentially. And so, I mean, you've seen gulls fighting over stuff. I mean, they're the most competitive around. And so, yeah, I think I'm really curious to do more work on it. But it's a really hard question to get at because you need a lot of data, essentially. Yeah. But there's a lot of really interesting research on just that.
And does the specialization, is it a behavioral adaptation, or are there physical changes to the bird anatomically that are
No,
coming?
not really. They have the machinery to access all different things, and that's why they can do it. So it's not so much that they're evolving and adapting physically, but it's more that they just have the behavioral strategies. Exactly. And it's it certainly could be a case of cultural transmission. So it's not like gulls teach their offspring to forage. They don't. They're on their own, right? As soon as they fledge the nest, you're on your own. That's the case in so many bird species, the majority of bird species. But that doesn't mean that they're not taking hints from the birds around them and following them around. So that's why I've wondered if the birds from, Whitehead Island are going to mink farms because they watch the birds leaving and they follow. Whereas birds from Vaughan Portage just aren't seeing other birds heading, inland north to Hilltown. So there's got to be some cultural transmission, behavioral transmission, and learning from each other because they're such smart birds too that they're just learning through their lifetime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alex has a couple questions. Alex, do you want to take yourself off mute and ask yourself?
Yeah, I'm off mute. Really great talk, Sarah. I really enjoyed it. I tend to get preoccupied with Briar Island for various reasons, but it struck me that Briar Island has really got everything it takes. It's right in the middle of all those resources. It's got fish farm right there, Finfish, aquaculture, salmon. It's got the mink farms, which are maybe an hour's flight away or something like that. And it's got a fish plant. So it looked to me as though all those briar gulls were not all going all that far. And so they're not using up that much energy. And presumably they've got that much more to put into eggs and into feeding young and so on. And that's a different kind of story from the one you've told, but it would be a natural kind of follow-up, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. I totally agree. And I think the big question about why these birds go so far, like why do the Kent Island birds, why are they willing to fly so far? It's got to be that the resources that they're accessing there are so high quality and so reliable and easily accessible that it's worth expending the energy to get there to eat that food. And when you think about what they're eating there, it's this, nasty, fatty carcasses and the feed that they're feeding the mink, the birds can get into as well, which is good food and just so easy, requires absolutely no work. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in those energetic trade-offs and how, is the colony at Briar Island growing so quickly because they have this smorgasbord, like you say, everything they want, any type of resource is so readily available to them. So much so that they're resources that birds are traveling super far to get, but they have it on their doorstep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy for them. They're happy gulls, that's for sure.
Yeah, except that now they've had their habitat drained on. Well, they've had their habitat flooded on them with the big meadow restoration. So it'd be really interesting. Becomes a very complicated story because now we've got another factor that's really extremely hard to quantify there entering all of this. But nonetheless, that's where we're at. Anyway, I really appreciate it. That was a terrific talk.
Thank you so much.
Alex.
Hello, you've answered one of my questions. I do want to echo Eric's comment that was an amazing talk. You did a great job of presenting it and making us understand the reasons why we're doing it. Yeah, I think it was just great work for sure. I was actually involved in some of the work on Whitehead, so I did hold some of those herring gulls. So it's really nice to see the data that came out of that project. Do you know if there are plans to include great blackback gulls in future research?
Not right now. So there was a study of a small scale study of blackbacks on Devil's Island that Rob Ronconi headed up, which I mean, you can look it up. It's an open access article as well, but not on the scale that we did for herring gulls. I think you're in the acknowledgements in this paper though, Alex, just so you know. I think you get a shout out in there.
Oh, good. Yeah, I've been bugging Sean for the last few months, asking him when the paper was going to be published. I'm quite excited to hear it's coming out soon.
Oh yeah, heck yes, it's going to be out in 2 weeks, I think.
Congratulations on that, Sarah.
Thank you.
Recently published. MB Whitcomb had a question. Want to take yourself off mute? Or maybe I'll read the question.
Read it.
Yeah, it's online here. So I don't know if MB Whitcomb, somebody know who that is? The first name of the person? Male, female? Anyway, the comment is that it's a very interesting presentation, that this person studies invasive species, and there always seem to be native species that benefit and reproduce like crazy with the new resource. Their overly represented population can cause problems within their own native ecology. I'd love to see this quantified with these birds, and that what specific impacts does this well-fed species have on other native species up and down the food chain?
Yeah, tough to quantify, but something that has been worked on here and in other places. But it's so hard to know what baseline interactions within the food web should be, right? So that's where we run into trouble with trying to understand these interactions and what the impacts are. But we know that gulls, herring gulls in particular, when they spend a lot of time on these uninhabited islands, for example, they act as vectors for nutrients, and they dump guano and nitrogen especially into these coastal island ecosystems, and that influences the flora. So eastern mountain avens is a species at risk, and it's been in decline, and we know that it's impacted directly by nutrient inputs from guano. And so we, on a case-by-case basis, on an island-by-island basis, these things are becoming more clear, but it's really hard to quantify in a way that you can generalize. But the same goes for, we've looked at diet of herring gulls using stable isotopes, and so their biochemistry, and looking at their blood and what the chemical nature of their blood tells us about what they eat. And we see very clearly that they eat other seabirds. There's a very clear signal, especially for storm petrels, for herring gulls in Newfoundland, for example, and the same with here. So we can start to tease out some of that stuff through some of these sort of more advanced scientific techniques. But again, it's on such a case-by-case basis. And when you look at the variation among individuals on any one colony, again, it's really hard to get a clear picture of exactly what the impacts could be, but we can say with confidence that there are impacts up and down the food chain, as you say. Yeah.
Chris Field, you had a couple questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Just echo what a good lecturer you are and how clearly you presented the results. I had two questions. One arising because I've been working on a project with some researchers at Dal on foraging from Sable Island, or seals from East Coast, and determining where they're foraging from 4 different colonies and what it is what the difference are among the colonies, very similar to what you've done. Mm-hmm. One of the issues that's hard with seals, and I don't know if it's an issue here, is determining when they're foraging and when they're transiting. Mm-hmm. So I would ask you if you had any issue with that. And the second question is just, there are hints with the seals that we conjecture that the seals are traveling a long way from the colony to feed, are doing it because of competition. They're being driven farther away because dominant seals, or dominant herring gulls in your case, are getting to the good sources and then others are not. So thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, Chris, that it could be competition that's driving those birds to go further afield. Quite a possibility. In terms of differentiating between when they're transiting and when they're not, that's why we're really careful about the language, calling it visits and not foraging stops, or because we don't know that they're foraging. We can't say for sure. But what I looked at was the movement rates of the birds, and there's a very clear break point in movement rates at 2 kilometers per hour. So you sort of have birds that are either moving really slow, less than 2 kilometers per hour, or birds that are moving much faster than that. And so that tells us that there's like a behavioral switch where you're either on the move or you're stopped, you're sticking around in a small area. And so it's not an uncommon way to work with this type of data to try and do that, but I wouldn't call it foraging, but I would call it potentially accessing resources given they're sticking around. Any one of those visits at a fish plant per se doesn't necessarily mean that a bird ate something at the fish plant, but it means that it went there. And did it go there for food, or did it go there to hang out with its buddies on the beach? Either way, the bird wouldn't be there if that industry wasn't there. And so we're still considering it, industry interaction, but you can't really say for sure what they're doing behaviorally. And that's part of this biologging science and trying to find the signals in the data that tell us something about the behavior, but knowing that we can't say for sure. Yeah. Interesting that you're involved in sable seal tracking. That's really cool.
Seb Pardo had a question.
Hey, Sarah. Great talk. That was super enjoyable. Very informative too. So thank you. My question has to do with the way when I think about gulls, the first thing that comes to mind with the human interactions is them chasing a fishing boat, which is how we usually, as birders, see them. So I wonder if you are able, with your method, to actually be able to count that as a visit, or because boats are constantly moving and they're doing a loop, and then you can't look at Google Earth and see there's a boat there, would you is that maybe a downside of the methodology that you used?
Absolutely. And that's a whole other layer to this analysis that I didn't have time to go into. So I'm glad you picked up on that. So I also categorized just offshore movements and looked at the percentage of time that the birds just spent offshore, whether it was classified as a visit or not. Because you're absolutely right. When we look at the average speed of a fishing vessel versus that 2 kilometer per hour cutoff, it's faster, even when they're hauling nets and doing things that would attract birds. They're moving faster than that. And so we know that we missed visitation behavior offshore, but it wasn't a focus. It was of our study. It was more inshore and onshore industry. But what I'd really like to do is look at bird movements relative to vessel movements. And I know that we can do that because the data exists with AIS, with automatic vessel tracking technology. And there's a group at Dalhousie that head up this project called Global Fishing Watch, and they've made that AIS data available. It's really cool. So yes, something that I'm really interested in, definitely something that we didn't pick up with our particular methodology, but yeah, you can't win them all. And I did look at it, and there's a very stark difference between the number of visits that we categorize as offshore versus just time spent offshore. So yeah, missing a lot of that offshore movement.
So do you think it would be, if you were able to categorize that, it would be quite a significant amount of time, significant use of habitat, those offshore visits to fishing boats comparatively with land-based resources?
So for some, but not all, because let me share my screen again with you because, oh, no, I can't. But if you look at the map of where the birds were moving, even just on transit, so when you see their transit lines, birds from some colonies just don't go offshore, regardless of whether there were visits or not. They just didn't. So for me, that was really surprising because I thought all gulls, at least some gulls from every colony, are going to be out there following fishing boats, but they weren't. And even birds from Kent Island that I would have expected those birds to be influenced by the fishing traffic out there, not nearly as much as I expected. And when they cross the Bay of Fundy to come to Nova Scotia, they beelined, like they aren't following vessels as they cross. They're just like to the mink farm and back, no farting around in between. And I was honestly really surprised by that. So I think I think in our region, our inshore and onshore industries are providing so much food for these birds that they don't need to go follow boats as much. Or we've also changed our practices with discards. So maybe they've learned that there just isn't as much free lunch from boats as there used to be.
Yeah, I imagine that the food at a place where it's reliable and you don't have to fly around, you can just wait on a roof. It's more bang for your buck than a boat. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jeff White had a question. I don't know, Jeff, if you still want to ask questions. I see that Alex had also responded to you.
I thought I typed it, you might read it, but anyway, thank you. I was just thinking about the big bog on Briar Island that Eric mentioned, and that the water table is supposed to be up and changing things. And is there any, just even casual observations, not to mention data that you know about that affecting the gull nesting yet?
I don't know if I'm not privy to the monitoring data that's coming in, but I know that they are still monitoring the colony and how they're going to adapt. And yeah, I mean, obviously it's going to have an impact, but what it is, I don't know. I mean, I've been in, it'll make it harder to study them, that's for sure, because there's still high points where they're going to nest. But to access their nests as researchers is going to get a lot harder for sure. Yeah.
I kept an eye on that during this summer as best I could, but without any quantitative kind of approach to it, unfortunately. And my impression is that there were many fewer young this year than there have been others. The number of juvenile gull road pizzas, for example, which are usually prevalent on the island in late summer, was virtually nil this year. Yeah. And the number of adults that were up over the major colony and the big meadow, it seemed to me was lower than usual, but it's purely qualitative, and we really need another survey of the kind that Brad Toms did a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, before we'll know what has really happened. But good point.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Eric. And I kind of forgot about COVID last summer, and it shut down basically all monitoring efforts. And so the timing of that is, is unfortunate for every research project that didn't happen last summer, but that's too bad. But yeah, good observations, and those will be useful.
Yuli, did you have a question?
First, I'd like to thank you for your interesting talk. Certainly a lot of good insight into an issue that in the past was a lot ignored. I have a question about the actual impact of the praxis, how animal waste is disposed, especially here in Nova Scotia and the area, because I mean, you may have heard that in Europe, the restrictions how you can dispose of animal carcasses and animal parts are restrictive to the point that the native vulture populations in parts of southwestern Europe are basically extinct because they can't find anymore, because as soon as something drops dead on a pasture, it's basically discharged and often incinerated. Mm-hmm. So now here, of course, in Nova Scotia, as we all know, there's basically, as far as to my knowledge, no limitation or regulation how you can dispose of animal carcass to the point that people bury dead horses somewhere in their backyard. And not even talking about the Eagle Watch in the valley where the dead chickens are put out. Now, you mentioned, of course, the recent events on mink farms in Europe where they had those massive cults of mink due to the COVID-19 concern. And I mean, this is an ongoing discussion for years and years and years, what the potential is to have pathogens spread, of course, first from animal carcasses that may have died for that particular reason to scavengers, and then from scavengers to other parts of the bird populations, and then again, of course, back from birds of the human, because as we all know, a couple of those viruses that are closely monitored are viruses that are native or present in birds, and where there is a reasonable expectation that at one point some of those will jump from birds on the human population. Like a couple of weeks back from Russia, that news that they had this whatever H5N whatever virus going from chickens on humans. So is it really still in any way or wouldn't it be the time to review the practice of disposing of animal carcasses the way it's done here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was back in, oh geez, it's probably 8 months ago now. I was asked by Environment Canada if they could share this work where at the state that it was then, which was almost complete, because there was a big working group around mink farming practices for that very reason, in response to COVID-19 and outbreaks on farms globally, but specifically because they knew that our gull population here is reliant on mink farms, access them, and the important part from this work is that clearly you could be moving pathogens far and wide from that one potential source. And so it was, I was really pleased that this work could help inform
and fast.
That.
Birds move fast. So
exactly. Yeah. And I mean, we had to act fast. I know that in response to COVID in particular, the waste management at mink farms was, there was a very rapid overhaul in practices. And there was also obviously rapid overhaul in how humans interact with mink. So, full PPE, but also trying to better contain any potential sources of spread beyond the facility. And so that was really important. There was actually in Utah at a mink farm, a case of COVID-19 being transmitted from the domesticated mink to wild mink. And so that set off huge alarm bells, which is another reason why the Canadian government started going to the provinces and saying, you need to do something about your mink farming, or we're going to call all your animals, essentially. And so, we've got 100,000 animals in Nova Scotia, and they wanted to see them protected. And so they pulled up their socks, so to speak, with some of the best practices in management. And I would hope that there's reasonable motivation to continue that, in perpetuity, because we can now see what the potential consequences are of that. But then, just on Monday, there was that case down in the Yarmouth area of gulls getting into a huge open vat of animal waste and getting oiled by it. And so, I mean, if there aren't red flags everywhere about this stuff, I don't know what that animal waste was. I think it was near a fish processing plant, so I assume that it was fisheries based, but it might not have been. It was going to a rendering facility for animal waste. And if you didn't read about that in the news, a lot of gulls managed to dunk themselves into an openly accessible container of very oily animal waste, and they're at Hope for Wildlife recovering from that. And clearly we're not learning our lesson fast enough.
I think there's always a possibility, no matter what rules you put in place, that there is neglect or ignorance of those rules by individuals. I mean, that can always happen, but I mean, to be able to ignore rules, you have to have them first, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
It's a step in the right direction. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Angie and Tony, I know you've been waiting patiently for a long time.
I just wondered whether there was any different in the age or sexes of the behaviour and the tracking. Was that monitored at all?
Yeah, so we only had adult birds. We don't know the age of the birds because they're all, after whatever, 8 years old or whatever it is in gulls with their crazy aging. And so they were all very mature adult gulls. And as for sex, we only knew sex for a very small number of the birds. Birds from Kent were sexed with blood samples, and that is actually part of another study that actually looked at their movements and their diet using those chemical tracers that I was talking about. And so there was, suffice to say, it doesn't seem like there's a difference really between males and females, because there's just so much individual specialization that it seems as though it's not girl boy dependent. It's more individual, and how it's probably personality. It's probably how competitive they are. Are they willing to fight it out, or do they go further afield? Like Chris was saying. So yeah, good question. And a question that I got from reviewers of my paper as well. Can't we look at age effects and sex effects and all these other fun things? And I wish. We just don't always have all that information.
John Kearney, you had a question.
I think Sarah's answered it already.
Okay, great. I think that's it for questions. Anybody else have, if I missed you, or if you have another question, Alex, if you're still here, you might be able to help. I don't see Alex. Anyway, I know
I'm
Alex.
here.
Oh, sorry, Alex, there you are. I just thought you might comment on the gulls and the oiling.
Oh yeah. So I think it was chicken waste, right? Yeah, it was a sad situation for sure. But luckily, there were people that were there to help out. And yeah, it's not easy to catch slippery gulls in tough to get places, right? And some of them could still fly, right? So they couldn't be captured. Yeah, and there were still some, I think, Kathleen, around. So there's still 2 left that can fly. So yeah, they're still there, being oiled and unhealthy. So yeah, you do as much as you can. Yeah.
Thank you.
I did have a question. If you had any recommendations for ongoing monitoring of the gulls, say if changes are made and that we'd like to track changes in the population, did your paper cover that, or do you have any ideas of how to go forward with that in the next years?
Yeah, it's always a tricky question because, well, research is expensive, quite frankly, and long-term monitoring is just not something that seems to be high on the research priority list anymore, which is really, it's a real shame, because we need, you need before, during, and after in order to see an effect. I guess the big question is what are we doing that we want to monitor the effects of? And as far as I know, there's no planned initiative to try and mitigate any of these effects at this stage. But if there were, I would absolutely advocate for continuing the tracking study that we've done in exactly the same way, so that we can actually see, how the gull's behavior changes, because ultimately it's a behavioral question more than anything. Behavioral, and then of course demographics. So we need to be monitoring their numbers, and we need to be monitoring their breeding success. Like Alex said about the birds on Briar, if we're having impacts on reproduction, then that's going to have a very big impact on the population. So yeah, we need to be doing both, but it's just not something that's really prioritized anymore. It's been a real bee in my bonnet for a while now about the lack of long-term monitoring in most bird programs. We're kind of like this flash in the pan tracking stuff because it's so hot and flashy, but it's actually not necessarily the most important thing to be doing. So keep eBirding, because
Yeah.
that is valuable data. I use that data every day in my research. So eBirding, Christmas bird counts, owl surveys, it's all so important. It's the
Yeah,
best
I
way to
am.
go.
I am in discussions, like preliminary discussions with Carell and Sabina and Sean about possibly doing monitoring of the gull colonies in Lobster Bay.
Yes.
We haven't gone into detail yet. You know, we haven't chosen islands and anything, or talked about protocol. But so hopefully that's something that I might be able to contribute going forward as well.
I know Carell is a big proponent of monitoring. He's the guy. He's the one he was instrumental in the care we took in phrasing in terms of not painting gulls as villains with this type of work, because, you know, he's an ecosystems management guy. And yeah, I think we're really fortunate to have people like him in government here locally.
Certainly a big picture guy for sure.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes too big. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This has been really good. I just did have one more. I want to give you one more opportunity to talk about eBird. Just, is it helpful to have comments about what we see? Because when you talk about not seeing herring gulls chasing boats, I think, well, let me tell you. So I wonder if those kinds of comments would be helpful for herring gulls for you.
So typically with a platform like eBird, it's more about data quantity.
Right.
You know, if you, for example, are reporting that you saw, you know, a vireo or heard a vireo, but you don't know which species it was, vireo sp, that will never be used for anything. It's just, you know, and that's great for your own personal records.
Sure.
But that's and comments, you know, breeding status and stuff is can be useful for sure, but only for very specific research. When you look at that that big paper that came out that found, you know, we've lost 1 in 4 birds in North America. That paper would have just trashed any uncertainty whatsoever and gone with the big numbers and the big numbers that you can count on. And so it's, you know, I don't know what's going to happen down the road, what could be useful down the road, but I can tell you right now that in terms of big data and what that citizen science or community science is really important for is just those baseline monitoring numbers and quantity. So for me personally, maybe, but could I even access that information? I don't even think so. Honestly, I think that in terms of, you know, I've downloaded eBird data off of the eBird server for research, and that stuff is lost. It's yeah. So it's just numbers and cells.
I think the comments are in all that data. I think they do get parsed out to make it easier to work with, but if you want them, they're there.
Yeah, I guess if you want them, they're there.
You need a student research project.
Yeah, it's a big one. I mean, eBird data is just, the volume of data is so enormous that in terms of utility, you know, maybe someday, and maybe these things will accumulate over time to the point where it is really useful. But if I was looking for specific data on, you know, gull behavior, I would probably go through a different avenue for that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Good to see